The night they laughed at the girl from the slums was the same night a billionaire stopped believing in the world he built. Rain slid down the towering glass walls of the Blackstone Imperial Hotel, turning Manhattan into a blurred painting of gold lights and shadowed streets 47 floors below, while chauffeurs in black coats opened doors for senators, celebrities, and women wrapped in diamonds worth more than entire neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. Naomi Carter stood beneath the glowing hotel canopy, clutching the strap of her worn leather purse with fingers stiff from the November cold. Her dark curls, damp from the rain, her long black coat too thin against the wind that rushed through Fifth Avenue like a living thing. At 24 she had mastered the art of becoming invisible, because invisibility was safer than humiliation, safer than pity, safer than the quiet judgment hidden behind polished smiles. But tonight invisibility failed her the moment she stepped toward the marble entrance. A security guard blocked her path with a glance that lingered too long on her discount shoes and faded sleeves. "This event is private, ma'am," he said carefully, though the meaning beneath his voice carried the weight of 1,000 closed doors. Naomi swallowed slowly, fighting the familiar burn climbing her throat. She reached into her purse and handed him the invitation, folded neatly at the corners, the gold lettering already softened from being reread too many times. "I'm here for the Callaway Foundation interview," she said softly. "They emailed me yesterday." The guard barely looked at the card before exhaling through his nose. Nearby guests turned subtly toward the scene, pretending not to stare while listening to every word. A woman in a silver fur coat tightened her lips in quiet amusement. Another man adjusted his cufflinks, as though Naomi's existence had interrupted the elegance of his evening. "These charity events really are getting creative," someone muttered beneath their breath, followed by restrained laughter that cut sharper than open cruelty. Naomi lowered her eyes for one dangerous second, not because she believed them but because surviving poverty taught people how to endure shame without collapsing. And somewhere high above the lobby, Damien Calloway watched the entire thing unfold through the tinted glass walls of the executive mezzanine. His reflection stared back at him from the window, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a midnight charcoal tuxedo worth $12,000, his silver watch catching fragments of chandelier light as board members continued talking behind him about merger percentages and political donors. At 36, Damien had spent half his life building an empire powerful enough to control banks, luxury hotels, media companies, and half the skyline glowing beneath the storm. But suddenly none of it held his attention, because downstairs a young woman stood completely alone beneath a crystal chandelier large enough to illuminate kingdoms, and somehow she looked stronger than every billionaire in the room combined. He noticed the way she held herself despite the humiliation, shoulders straight, chin lifted, eyes calm, not defeated, simply tired in the way people became after fighting battles nobody else could see. Damien barely heard the executive beside him discussing stock projections because something unfamiliar had settled beneath his ribs, something sharp and unsettling. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. One of the assistants glanced toward the lobby monitor and shrugged. "Probably another girl hoping charity can change her life." Damien's jaw tightened almost invisibly below the lobby. Naomi accepted the invitation back into her trembling hands, preparing herself to leave before dignity became impossible. The rain outside had grown heavier now, turning the hotel windows into rivers of silver, and for a brief moment she caught her reflection in the glass, a poor black girl from the South Side standing outside a world never designed for people like her. Then the elevator doors behind the security desk opened and silence spread across the marble lobby with frightening speed. Damien Calloway stepped forward like a man carved from shadow, and old money conversations died. Champagne glasses paused midair, cameras shifted instinctively toward him, because powerful men changed the atmosphere simply by arriving. But Damien wasn't looking at investors or socialites, he was looking only at Naomi, his gray eyes steady, unreadable, intense enough to make the room itself feel smaller. The security guard straightened immediately. "Mr. Calloway, sir, I was just handling—" "No," Damien interrupted calmly, his voice smooth as dark whiskey. "You were embarrassing my guest." The room froze. Naomi blinked slowly, certain she had misunderstood, but Damien crossed the marble floor without hesitation until he stood directly before her, close enough for her to catch the faint scent of cedar and winter cologne beneath the rain. His gaze lowered briefly toward the invitation still clenched in her hand before returning to her face, and for the first time all night someone looked at her without mockery, without pity, without doubt. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I've been waiting for you." The silence inside the Blackstone Imperial stretched so sharply that even the piano music near the ballroom entrance seemed to disappear beneath it. Naomi Carter stared at Damien Calloway as though he had spoken in another language, because men like him did not Notice women like her not unless they were being escorted out of rooms exactly like this one, yet his expression remained calm, almost detached, as though defending her before Manhattan's elite was the most ordinary thing in the world. The security guard stepped back, immediately color draining from his face, while whispers rippled across the marble lobby like cracks through glass. That is Damien Calloway. Why is he talking to her? Who is she? Naomi felt every stare pressing against her skin, but Damien did not seem affected by any of it. His attention remained fixed entirely on her, and somehow that unsettled her more than the humiliation from minutes earlier, because cruelty she understood. Kindness from powerful men always came with a price. I think there has been a misunderstanding, Naomi said, carefully finding her voice again. I can leave. Damien's gray eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, not angry, not offended, simply studying her with a focus that made her feel seen in a way she had spent years avoiding. You came here for an interview, he replied smoothly, so you will be interviewed. His tone carried the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to reshaping outcomes with a single sentence, and before Naomi could protest he turned slightly toward the hotel staff. Prepare the West Lounge, he said, and have someone bring Miss Carter a dry coat. The manager nearly stumbled over himself, nodding too quickly while nearby socialites exchanged confused glances. Naomi tightened her grip on her purse, instinct screaming at her not to trust this situation, because nothing in her life had ever arrived wrapped in chandeliers and billionaire smiles without eventually demanding something painful in return. Damien seemed to notice the hesitation in her eyes, because his voice lowered when he spoke again, softer, now almost private. You are cold, he said. Simply, that is not how guests are treated in my hotel. My hotel. The words settled heavily between them. Naomi followed him through the grand lobby, feeling the weight of hundreds of curious eyes tracking every step. Her shoes clicked quietly against the polished marble, while crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead like suspended galaxies. She had never walked beside a man whose presence altered rooms before. Damien did not need to raise his voice. People moved for him instinctively. Waiters straightened, executives silenced, even the air itself seemed more careful around him. They entered the West Lounge, hidden behind frosted glass doors, where the noise of the gala faded into warm jazz and golden light. A fire flickered beneath a white stone mantel, illuminating shelves lined with rare books and black leather chairs overlooking the rain-soaked skyline. Manhattan glowed beyond the windows, cold, beautiful, untouchable. Naomi stopped near the doorway, uncertain whether she belonged in a room that probably cost more per night than her monthly rent. Damien removed his tuxedo jacket without ceremony and handed it to her. Take it, he said when she hesitated. That was not a suggestion. The fabric carried warmth, cedar cologne, and the quiet weight of impossible wealth. Naomi slipped it around her shoulders, slowly aware that her hands were trembling from more than the cold. Damien loosened his cufflinks before pouring sparkling water into a crystal glass, then finally looked directly at her again. Do you know why your application stood out? He asked. Naomi shook her head honestly. She almost had not submitted the scholarship application at all. Women from neighborhoods like hers learned early not to expect doors to open, especially not doors guarded by men named Calloway. Damien rested one hand against the edge of the fireplace, his silver watch catching amber firelight, because every other applicant wrote about escaping poverty. He said quietly, you wrote about rebuilding the neighborhood you came from. Naomi blinked, surprised. He had actually read it. Most people hear where I am from and decide who I am before I speak, she admitted. That is because most people are weak thinkers. His answer came instantly, calm, sharp, absolute. Rain struck the tall windows behind him while the fire painted shadows across the room, and for one strange suspended moment Naomi forgot about the ballroom, the humiliation, the whispers. All she saw was a billionaire standing alone in a room full of luxury, looking at her like she was the first honest thing he had seen in years. Then Damien reached into the inner pocket of his vest and placed a folded document on the marble table between them. I have a proposition for you, Miss Carter, he said softly, one that could change both our lives. The folded document remained untouched on the marble table between them while rain continued sliding down the towering windows behind Damien Calloway. Naomi stared at the cream-colored paper embossed with the silver Calloway crest, feeling the quiet danger hidden beneath expensive elegance, because men like Damien never offered opportunities without calculations attached to them. She had grown up watching landlords smile while raising rent, watching politicians promise hope before disappearing into black SUVs. Kindness wrapped in luxury had always frightened her more than open cruelty. Damien seemed perfectly patient, as though he already understood every doubt moving through her mind. The firelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face, turning him into Something almost unreal, too composed, too controlled, too accustomed to winning you. Have not asked what the proposition is, he said finally. Naomi lifted her eyes toward him carefully. People with your kind of money usually ask for something before they explain themselves. For the first time a faint shadow of amusement touched Damien's expression, not enough to soften him but enough to reveal the man beneath the Billionaire headline's fair point. He admitted quietly. He moved toward the windows overlooking Manhattan, his reflection merging with the storm outside, while Naomi remained near the fireplace wrapped in his tuxedo jacket which still carried warmth from his body. The contrast unsettled her. She had spent years surviving cramped apartments, crowded buses, and neon-lit convenience stores. Now suddenly she stood inside a room where silence itself sounded expensive. My family's foundation is finalizing a merger with one of the oldest investment dynasties in New York, Damien said without turning around. The board wants stability, tradition, the appearance of a perfect future. Naomi folded her arms slowly. And what does that have to do with me? Damien finally faced her again, his gray eyes unreadable. They want me married before the end of the fiscal year. The words landed heavily in the golden room. Naomi blinked once, uncertain whether she had misunderstood him. You cannot possibly be serious. I never joke about business. Outside, thunder rolled softly through the skyline while Damien walked back toward the marble table and opened the document between them. Pages of legal language shimmered beneath the chandelier light. Signatures, clauses, timelines, every line precise, cold, meticulous. 1 year. He said calmly. You would live with me, attend public events, represent the Callaway name, and in return I would fund every educational and community initiative you described in your application, including the redevelopment project on South Wabash Avenue. Naomi's breath caught. Despite herself, South Wabash, the street where abandoned buildings leaned against each other like tired ghosts, where children walked past broken liquor stores to reach overcrowded schools, where her mother still lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with windows that rattled every winter. She had written about rebuilding it only because nobody else ever would. Damien studied her carefully as though measuring the exact moment hope collided with suspicion. Why me? She whispered. You could choose anyone. His silence stretched for a second too long before he answered, because everyone in my world performs perfection. His gaze sharpened slightly. You do not. Naomi looked away, first unable to hold the intensity in his eyes for too long, because something dangerous lived there. Not desire, not pity, something deeper, loneliness, perhaps the kind carried by people who spent too many years surrounded by power and too few years surrounded by truth. You do not even know me, she said softly. I know enough. Damien's voice lowered, quieter, now almost tired. I know you walked into a room designed to humiliate people like you, and you still kept your dignity. The fire cracked softly behind her. Naomi felt suddenly aware of every difference between them. His custom Italian shoes, her scuffed heels, his world of private jets and boardrooms, her world of overdue bills and flickering laundromats. Yet somehow Damien looked at her as though none of that mattered, and that frightened her most of all, because people who ignored reality often destroyed others without meaning to. This is not a marriage, she said carefully, it is an arrangement. Correct. And after 1 year? Damien's jaw tightened almost invisibly. After 1 year you are free. Free, the word echoed strangely inside her, because freedom had always sounded beautiful to people who already possessed it. Naomi stepped closer to the table, reading the final page where her name had already been typed beside his in elegant black ink. Naomi Carter and Damien Alexander Callaway, side by side like two worlds forced into the same sentence. If I say no, she asked. Damien held her gaze steadily, then answered with devastating honesty. Then tomorrow morning you go back to surviving while I go back to pretending none of this matters. Manhattan shimmered beyond the windows, cold silver, endless, and for the first time in years Naomi felt the terrifying sensation that her entire life had just reached the edge of something irreversible. Then Damien slid a fountain pen across the marble toward her and said softly, the choice is yours, Miss Carter. Naomi did not remember signing the contract, only the sound of rain against glass and the strange heaviness in her chest as Damien Callaway's fountain pen moved across paper that would permanently divide her life into before and after. 3 days later she stood inside the private elevator of the Callaway penthouse, watching gold numbers climb toward the 73rd floor while her reflection stared back at her from mirrored walls. A girl from South Wabash Avenue carrying a single suitcase into a World built for people who had never checked grocery prices before buying fruit. The elevator doors opened soundlessly, revealing a hallway lined with white marble and soft amber lighting that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive candles. Naomi stepped out slowly, trying not to show how overwhelming everything felt because the silence alone seemed richer than entire neighborhoods she had known. Damien waited near the panoramic windows, dressed in a charcoal sweater and dark slacks. No cameras, no tuxedo, no billionaire performance, just a tall, quiet man holding a crystal glass of water while Manhattan glowed behind him like another galaxy. "You are late by 4 minutes, he said calmly. Naomi narrowed her eyes immediately. "Good evening to you too." Something almost resembling satisfaction crossed his face before disappearing. "Welcome home, Miss Carter." Home, the word sounded dangerous coming from him because Naomi had spent her entire life learning that temporary places should never be trusted. Damien gestured toward the sprawling penthouse where floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the skyline, polished black shelves held first-edition books, modern paintings rested beneath warm recessed lighting, and somewhere deeper inside soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The entire residence looked less like an apartment and more like a carefully controlled kingdom. "A stylist will arrive at 9 tomorrow morning," Damien continued. "There will also be etiquette coaching, media preparation, and wardrobe consultations over the next few weeks." Naomi placed her worn suitcase near the staircase, her shoulders tightening. "You make it sound like I am joining the military. High society is far less forgiving." His answer came instantly. Naomi exhaled quietly, then wandered farther into the penthouse, fingertips brushing the edge of a marble island in the kitchen where untouched white roses stood inside a crystal vase. Everything looked immaculate, untouched, unlived in. She suddenly realized there were no family photographs anywhere, no childhood memories, no warmth, only perfection. Damien watched her carefully as though he already understood what she noticed. "Nobody really lives here," she murmured before she could stop herself. He held her gaze from across the room. "That is the first honest thing anyone has said about this place in years." The confession lingered unexpectedly between them before a sharp clicking sound interrupted the silence. High heels against marble. A tall blonde woman entered through the hallway carrying garment bags and a digital tablet. Her expression faltered the moment she saw Naomi. "Mr. Calloway," she said carefully, "I was not aware your guest had already arrived." Guest? Naomi noticed the slight hesitation before the word, as if the woman had considered saying something else. Damien remained perfectly composed. "Claire, this is Naomi Carter." Claire's professional smile returned quickly but not warmly. Her gaze swept over Naomi's natural curls, simple clothes, and old suitcase with polished efficiency. "Of course," she said, "we have a great deal of work ahead of us." Naomi understood the insult beneath the elegance immediately because women like Claire did not need cruel words. They weaponized tone, posture, silence. Damien seemed to notice Naomi stiffen because his voice sharpened slightly. "Miss Carter is not a project." Claire lowered her eyes at once. "Understood, sir." But Naomi was no fool. She had spent years recognizing the invisible hierarchy hidden inside wealthy rooms, and tonight she stood at the very bottom of it. Damien crossed toward the bar area, pouring another glass of sparkling water while city lights flickered against the windows. "Tomorrow evening there will be a dinner with the Calloway board members," he said. "You only need to survive 2 hours." Naomi laughed softly despite herself. "That sounds encouraging. It is realistic." He handed her the glass and their fingers brushed briefly, warm against cold. Neither reacted outwardly, but the silence afterward felt strangely louder. Naomi moved toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. Yellow taxi lights crawled through the streets below like scattered fireflies. Somewhere down there her mother was probably finishing a late nursing shift while neighbors argued through thin apartment walls and trains rattled past cracked buildings. Everything familiar suddenly felt impossibly far away. "You are regretting this already," Damien observed quietly. Naomi stared at her reflection in the dark glass. A black girl from the South Side, wrapped in borrowed luxury, standing 73 floors above a city that had spent her whole life telling her where she belonged. Then she lifted her chin slowly and answered without turning around, "No, Mr. Calloway." Her voice became calm, steady, dangerous in its own quiet way. "I am just realizing your world is going to hate me long before it ever learns my name." The first week inside the Calloway penthouse felt less like luxury and more like survival. Wrapped in silk, every morning Naomi woke beneath cream-colored linen sheets softer than anything she had touched before, only to spend the next 12 hours learning how wealthy People disguised cruelty as sophistication. Claire arrived precisely at 8 each day carrying designer dresses and impossible expectations while etiquette instructors corrected the angle of Naomi's posture, the placement of her silverware and the cadence of her voice as though dignity itself required expensive training again. Claire said sharply as Naomi practiced walking across the marble floor in black heels that cost more than 3 months of rent back on South Wabash. A woman beside Damien Calloway does not look uncertain. Naomi stopped near the grand piano, breathing carefully through the ache in her feet. Maybe a woman beside Damien Calloway should be allowed to walk like a human being. Claire's polished smile tightened instantly, but before she could respond a familiar voice drifted from the doorway. I agree. Naomi turned sharply. Damien stood there with one hand in his coat pocket, fresh snow clinging faintly to the shoulders of his dark overcoat as Manhattan's winter storm painted silver light across the penthouse windows. He looked exhausted, distant, colder somehow than usual, yet his eyes softened for one brief second when they landed on Naomi. Claire straightened immediately. Mr. Calloway, we were preparing for tomorrow's charity gala. Damien loosened his gloves slowly, his attention never leaving Naomi clearly. The silence afterward carried enough tension to sharpen glass. Claire gathered her garment bags without another word and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Naomi alone with the billionaire who had turned her entire life upside down. Damien walked toward the bar, pouring sparkling water into 2 crystal glasses before handing one to her. You are angry, he observed. Naomi accepted the glass carefully. Your people treat me like a problem they are trying to polish. Damien leaned lightly against the marble counter, shadows moving across his face beneath the chandelier light. My world believes perfection can be purchased. Naomi gave a quiet, humorless laugh. And can it? For the first time in days, Damien looked genuinely uncertain. I used to think so. Snow drifted beyond the towering windows while jazz music hummed softly through hidden speakers. Naomi studied him more carefully now. Without the gala crowds or boardroom armor, he looked less like the untouchable billionaire from magazine covers and more like a man carrying exhaustion too heavy to name. Why do you never smile? She asked suddenly. Damien blinked once, clearly caught off guard. Excuse me? I mean really smile. Naomi shrugged lightly. You look like someone who forgot how years ago. He stared at her in silence long enough that she wondered if she had crossed a line, but instead of anger something stranger appeared in his expression. Surprise, perhaps because nobody in his world spoke to him without fear or calculation. People usually avoid psychoanalyzing billionaires, he said quietly. Naomi moved toward the windows overlooking Central Park, now covered beneath fresh snow. People usually avoid girls from the South Side too. Her reflection shimmered against the dark glass, elegant black dress, natural curls, gold earrings Claire had chosen. She barely recognized herself anymore, and somehow that frightened her more than the wealth surrounding her, because transformation happened slowly, quietly, until one day mirrors began showing strangers. Damien stepped beside her, not too close but close enough that his presence altered the air itself. Do you miss it? He asked. Naomi frowned slightly. Miss what? Your old life. She looked down at the taxis crawling through Manhattan like streams of amber light before answering. I miss knowing who I was in it. Damien's jaw tightened subtly as though her honesty unsettled him more than polished conversation ever could. Then his phone buzzed sharply against the marble counter. He glanced at the screen and something cold immediately returned to his face. The board moved tomorrow's gala to tonight, he said. Media pressure after the merger rumors. Naomi exhaled slowly. And I suppose your fake wife is suddenly required? Yes. The answer came too quickly, too professionally, and for a second disappointment flickered through her chest before she could stop it. Damien seemed to notice because his voice lowered almost imperceptibly. You do not have to do this if you feel unprepared. Naomi turned fully toward him now, shoulders straight, chin lifted the same way she had stood beneath humiliation at the Blackstone Imperial days earlier. No, she said calmly, I think your world has underestimated me long enough. Something shifted in Damien's expression, then not desire, not amusement, something deeper, admiration, perhaps dangerous in its quietness. He reached toward the velvet box resting beside the fireplace and opened it, revealing a black satin gown that shimmered beneath the golden light like midnight water. Naomi stared breathless at the elegance of it while Damien's voice softened into something almost reverent. Tonight, he said carefully, they are going to see you the way I do. By the time the black town car stopped beneath the towering entrance of the Astoria Grand Hall, snow had begun falling harder across Manhattan. covering the city in silver and gold while photographers crowded behind velvet ropes waiting for America's wealthiest families to arrive. Naomi sat silently beside Damien Calloway, her hands folded carefully against the black satin fabric draped around her body. The gown fit like quiet power, elegant without trying too hard, the kind of beauty that did not beg to be noticed because it already knew its worth. Damien adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo beside her, his expression unreadable beneath the glow of passing streetlights, but Naomi noticed the moment his eyes shifted toward her and stayed there just slightly too long. "What?" she asked softly. Damien looked away almost immediately. "Nothing." Naomi tilted her head, unconvinced. That did not sound like nothing. He exhaled slowly through his nose before answering in the low, controlled voice that always seemed to carry more meaning than his words themselves. "You look." He stopped, searching for language for perhaps the first time in years, then finally finished quietly, "You look impossible to ignore." Heat rose unexpectedly beneath Naomi's skin and she turned toward the rain-streaked window before he could notice, because compliments from Damien never sounded casual, they sounded dangerous, like truths he regretted revealing too soon. Outside, camera flashes exploded against the snowfall as the driver opened Damien's door first. The entire entrance shifted instantly. Reporters straightened, guests whispered, security tightened around the staircase. Power moved through the air the moment Damien stepped into it, and then Naomi emerged beside him. Conversations stopped, literally stopped, as if someone had pulled the sound from the world. Women wrapped in diamonds stared openly while businessmen lowered champagne glasses halfway to their lips. Naomi felt every eye follow the black satin gown, the natural curls resting against her shoulders, the calm dignity in the way she carried herself, but she refused to lower her head. "Not tonight." Damien offered his arm without speaking and Naomi accepted it slowly. Together they crossed beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Astoria, where marble floors reflected rivers of golden light. String music floated through the ballroom while enormous floral arrangements towered like sculptures around politicians, investors, and old money families who had spent generations convincing themselves elegance belonged exclusively to them. Naomi could practically feel their confusion. A black girl from the South Side standing beside New York's most untouchable billionaire, not hidden, not ashamed, but introduced to the world like she belonged there. Damien leaned slightly closer as cameras flashed around them. "Do not let them intimidate you." Naomi kept her gaze forward. "I stopped being intimidated when I realized rich people gossip exactly like everyone else." A faint breath of laughter escaped him so quietly she almost missed it, but before either of them could speak again, a woman in an ivory designer gown approached with perfect blonde waves and the kind of beauty magazines described as timeless. Her smile sharpened the instant she saw Naomi. "Damien," she said smoothly, kissing the air beside his cheek, "you disappeared from Manhattan for weeks and return with a mystery woman. How dramatic." Naomi felt Damien's posture stiffen almost invisibly. "Victoria Holloway," he said coolly, "you remember how introductions work." Victoria finally turned toward Naomi, her pale blue eyes scanning the black satin gown, the diamond earrings, the elegance she clearly had not expected to find. "Of course," she said sweetly, though nothing about her sounded kind, "I simply assumed Damien preferred women from slightly more refined circles." The insult floated softly enough that nearby guests pretended not to hear. Naomi recognized the tactic immediately, cruelty polished until it looked like sophistication. She smiled calmly instead of retreating, "and I assumed refinement included manners." Silence spread around them, sharp and immediate. One older woman nearly choked on her champagne while Damien's gray eyes flickered toward Naomi with unmistakable surprise. Victoria's smile faltered for half a second before hardening again. "How refreshing," she replied tightly. "Confidence is very fashionable this season." "So is honesty," Naomi answered. Damien lifted his champagne glass slowly, clearly fighting something dangerously close to amusement, while Victoria realized too late that the girl from South Wabash Avenue was not built to shrink beneath expensive insults. Then the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the foundation chairman stepped onto the stage, preparing to announce the merger. Partnership conversations softened. Guests moved toward their tables and Damien rested one steady hand against Naomi's back, guiding her through the crowd, but before they reached the front row, Naomi overheard two women whisper behind crystal wine glasses, "She is beautiful," one admitted reluctantly. "Yes," the other replied quietly, "that is the problem." Naomi looked up toward the massive chandelier glittering above the ballroom while Damien's hand remained warm against her back, and for the first time since entering his world she realized something important. They had expected her to arrive ashamed, instead she had arrived unforgettable. The moment Naomi and Damien entered the grand ballroom together, the balance of the evening changed completely. Old money families who had spent decades controlling every guest list, every headline, and every social alliance suddenly found themselves watching a black woman from South Wabash Avenue become the center of a room designed to exclude people like her. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of glittering guests while the orchestra played softly beneath the murmur of political conversations and billion-dollar negotiations, but Naomi could still feel the stares following her across the marble floor, some curious, some threatened, some openly resentful. Damien remained beside her with calm precision, one hand resting lightly against the small of her back, not possessive, not performative, simply steady, as if he had already decided she belonged there regardless of what the room believed. Breathe, he murmured quietly near her ear. Naomi glanced sideways at him. I am breathing. No, Damien replied calmly, you are preparing for battle. The frightening part was that he understood her correctly. Naomi lifted a champagne glass from a passing tray, though she barely drank from it because growing up poor taught people to stay alert in unfamiliar spaces. Every conversation around her sounded polished, but underneath the luxury she recognized the same thing she had seen her whole life: fear. People with power always feared anyone who threatened the order that protected them. The foundation chairman finally stepped onto the stage beneath a cascade of gold lights, thanking investors and board members for supporting the Callaway merger initiative. Applause moved politely through the ballroom while photographers captured every smile, every handshake, every expensive illusion. Damien's expression remained unreadable beside Naomi, but she noticed how often executives approached him seeking approval, as though his silence carried more authority than their speeches ever could. Tonight represents the future of the Callaway Foundation, the chairman announced proudly, a future built on legacy, tradition, and excellence. Naomi felt Damien's fingers tighten slightly against her back at the word tradition, then suddenly enormous digital screens surrounding the ballroom flickered once the music stuttered softly and confusion spread across the room. Conversations slowed, guests turned toward the stage, technicians whispered urgently near control panels, and then Naomi's world stopped. On the giant screens appeared grainy cell phone footage from South Wabash Avenue. Naomi, years younger, wearing a grocery store uniform, carrying bags through rain, while men somewhere off camera laughed crudely about the slum virgin girl who thought education would save her. Another clip followed Naomi stepping onto a crowded city bus while someone mocked her worn shoes, then another and another. Fragments of humiliation stolen from years she had worked desperately to survive. The ballroom fell silent, utterly silent. Naomi could hear only the rushing sound of blood in her ears as her own past towered 20 feet above Manhattan's wealthiest families. Somebody near the back laughed quietly. Another guest whispered, "Oh my God," beneath a hand covered in diamonds. Damien turned instantly toward the technical booth, his face colder than Naomi had ever seen, but before he could move, Victoria Holloway appeared near the stage with calculated shock painted across her elegant features. "This is horrible," she said loudly, though satisfaction gleamed behind her eyes. Who would leak something so embarrassing? Naomi understood immediately. Of course it was Victoria, because women who feared losing power always attacked dignity first. The screens continued flashing cruel captions beside Naomi's old photograph: Southside Charity Project or future MIS Callaway. Questions spread across the ballroom like poison. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others fascinated, but the worst part was not the judgment, it was the pity. Naomi felt it everywhere. Rich people loved pity because it allowed them to feel superior. While pretending to be compassionate, Damien stepped forward sharply, his jaw rigid enough to cut glass. "Turn it off now." His voice carried through the ballroom like thunder, and staff members scrambled instantly, but Naomi barely noticed because suddenly she was 17 again, standing inside discount stores counting dollars before buying winter boots, hearing classmates whisper that girls from neighborhoods like hers never escaped. The final image appeared on the screen: Naomi outside a rundown apartment building beneath flickering streetlights, tired, determined, painfully young, and beneath it a single sentence glowed in silver letters: "She will never belong here." Silence followed, heavy, suffocating, absolute. Then Naomi inhaled slowly, lifted her chin, and did the one thing nobody in the ballroom expected. She walked forward alone. Crystal lights shimmered against the black satin of her gown as hundreds of powerful people watched her approach the center of the room, without tears, without panic, without shame. Damien stared at her with something dangerously close to concern, but Naomi kept moving until she stood directly beneath the giant screen displaying the worst years of her life. She looked up at the image for one long quiet moment before turning calmly toward the crowd. "You are right. she said softly, and somehow her voice carried farther than the microphones. I did come from places this room would rather forget. No one moved, no one even breathed. Naomi's eyes swept slowly across Manhattan's elite while gold chandelier light reflected against her skin like armor. But if surviving poverty embarrasses you more than cruelty does, she continued quietly, then perhaps I am not the one who does not belong here. For 3 full seconds after Naomi spoke, nobody in the Astoria Grand Ballroom moved. The orchestra had stopped completely. Champagne glasses remained frozen midair, and Manhattan's wealthiest families stood beneath crystal chandeliers staring at the black woman they had tried to humiliate, only to discover she carried herself with more grace than all of them combined. Damian Calloway watched her from several feet away, unable to look anywhere else because suddenly the ballroom no longer belonged to billionaires, politicians, or old money dynasties. It belonged to Naomi, standing alone beneath giant screens displaying the worst moments of her life while somehow looking more powerful than anyone in the room. Victoria Holloway recovered first. Of course women like Victoria survived by adapting quickly. Well, she said lightly, forcing a brittle smile that was unexpectedly dramatic. Naomi turned toward her calmly, no anger, no tears, just stillness, and somehow that frightened Victoria more than outrage ever could. Damian stepped forward, then his voice cold enough to freeze the room. You arranged this? Victoria laughed softly, though uncertainty flashed across her face. Please Damian, you cannot seriously believe I would sabotage a Calloway Foundation gala. I believe, Damian replied quietly, that you have spent your entire life mistaking cruelty for class. The words landed like shattered glass across the ballroom. Several executives immediately looked away, pretending sudden interest in their phones, while Victoria's expression tightened beneath layers of polished elegance. You are defending her? She whispered sharply. Damian did not even hesitate. I am defending the only honest person in this room. Silence again, heavier, now more dangerous. Naomi stared at him, stunned, because powerful men usually protected reputations before people, especially men raised inside dynasties like the Calloways. But Damian looked at Victoria with complete indifference, as though her beauty, status, and influence no longer held any value at all. The merger announcement is finished, Damian said calmly to the stunned foundation chairman near the stage. Cancel the remainder of the gala. Shock rippled instantly through the board members. One older investor stepped forward, pale with panic. Damian, this event cost nearly $8 million. The press is here, the donors are. I do not care. His voice never rose, but the room recoiled anyway, because real power rarely needed volume. Damian turned slowly toward the guests, his gray eyes colder than the Manhattan snowstorm raging outside. Tonight you mocked a woman for surviving circumstances most of you would not last 1 week inside. Nobody answered. Photographers lowered cameras, uncertain whether documenting the moment would destroy their careers or define them forever. Damian's gaze swept across the ballroom with quiet disgust. You sit beneath chandeliers discussing morality while entire neighborhoods fight to keep their children alive through winter. His jaw tightened subtly, and somehow you convinced yourselves that poverty is shameful but arrogance is refinement. Naomi felt her breath catch, because she had never seen him like this. Not the polished billionaire from magazine covers, not the controlled strategist from boardrooms. This was something else, a man finally exhausted by the emptiness surrounding him. Victoria crossed her arms defensively. You are throwing away decades of relationships over one girl? Damian looked toward Naomi then, and everything in his expression changed. Not softer exactly, but real. No, he said quietly, I am finally seeing which relationships deserve to be lost. The ballroom remained utterly silent as snow drifted beyond the towering windows, turning Manhattan into blurred silver light. Naomi suddenly became aware of the giant screen still frozen behind her, displaying the younger version of herself outside that crumbling apartment building. Tired, poor, determined. Damian noticed too, because without warning he walked past hundreds of stunned guests directly toward the stage, took the microphone from the foundation chairman, and faced the room. You see a girl from the South Side, he said evenly. I see a woman who built dignity out of circumstances this city abandoned. Naomi's throat tightened unexpectedly. Damian continued, his voice low, measured, devastating in its honesty. Most people in this ballroom inherited their confidence. His eyes shifted toward her beneath the chandelier light. She earned hers. No applause followed, because the truth had made everyone too uncomfortable to perform appreciation. Naomi lowered her gaze briefly, struggling against emotions she did not trust herself to name, while photographers captured every second, cameras flashing like lightning. Around the room then Damien stepped down from the stage, crossed the ballroom once more and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that only she could hear the next words. "I am sorry," he said softly, and for the first time since she met him Naomi heard genuine regret beneath the control. "I brought you into a world that does not deserve you." The snow continued falling outside the Astoria Grand Hall while Manhattan's elite stood speechless beneath millions of dollars in crystal and gold, watching the most powerful man in the city choose a black woman from South Wabash Avenue over the empire built around him. And somewhere deep inside the silence Naomi realized the dangerous truth: this arrangement had stopped feeling fake a long time ago. 1 year later, the old abandoned bank building on South Wabash Avenue no longer smelled like dust, broken concrete, and forgotten dreams. Sunlight now poured through towering restored windows, illuminating polished oak floors, classrooms filled with books, and walls painted in warm gold and deep emerald tones where cracked plaster once crumbled beneath leaking ceilings. Outside, a bronze sign shimmered beneath the Chicago morning light: the Naomi Carter Foundation for Women and Children. Reporters crowded the sidewalks, cameras flashing beside city officials and volunteers, while women from every part of the South Side gathered beneath white winter tents, carrying coffee cups, gloved hands, and expressions that looked dangerously close to hope. Naomi stood quietly near the entrance, adjusting the sleeve of her cream wool coat as snow drifted softly through the air around her. She no longer looked like the frightened girl who once stood outside luxury hotels waiting to be judged. There was something calmer about her now. Stronger elegance no longer looked borrowed on her, it looked earned. Her dark curls rested softly against her shoulders, and the gold earrings she wore had belonged to her mother, who stood nearby speaking proudly with local teachers and community leaders. "You built all this in 11 months? One reporter asked in disbelief. Naomi smiled faintly. "No," she answered, "people in this neighborhood built it long before I arrived back." Her voice carried the same quiet steadiness that had once silenced Manhattan's elite, only now it held peace instead of survival. She moved through the restored building, greeting children, hugging volunteers, listening carefully when elderly women thanked her for remembering streets everyone else abandoned, because that was the difference. Naomi had not escaped the South Side, she had returned for it. Camera flashes suddenly intensified outside the foundation entrance, followed by whispers spreading quickly through the crowd. Naomi looked up instinctively just as a black town car stopped beside the curb and Damien Calloway stepped out into the snowfall. A year ago his arrival would have felt like power itself. Now it felt strangely human. He wore a dark charcoal coat. No security entourage, no board members, no cameras invited by his team. Only one man walking alone through falling snow toward the woman who had permanently changed him. Conversations softened immediately because even after stepping away from the merger empire, Damien remained one of the most powerful men in America, but something about him looked different now, lighter, perhaps as though losing pieces of his old world had finally allowed him to breathe. Naomi watched him approach slowly, memories flickering between them. Rain against Manhattan glass, black satin beneath chandeliers, words spoken in crowded ballrooms, and all the silence that followed. Damien stopped only inches away, snow melting against the shoulders of his coat. While the city noise faded into the distance, "You did it," he said quietly. Naomi glanced around the foundation, children laughing, volunteers hanging decorations, sunlight filling rooms once forgotten by the world. "No," she answered softly, "we did." For a moment neither spoke because some feelings became too large for language. Damien looked toward the restored classrooms, then back at her with the same intensity that once unsettled her beneath crystal chandeliers, except now there was no calculation left in it. Only truth. "The board still says I destroyed the future of the Calloway merger," he admitted. Naomi folded her hands calmly against her coat. "And what do you say?" Damien's eyes held hers steadily while snow drifted between them like suspended light. "I think it was the first meaningful decision I ever made." Naomi looked away, briefly smiling to herself, because a year ago Damien Calloway had believed transformation meant refinement, polished perfection. Now he stood in the middle of the South Side, realizing real transformation had nothing to do with wealth at all. It was about becoming someone capable of seeing humanity before status. A little girl suddenly rushed through the foundation doors, nearly slipping on the snowy steps before Naomi caught her gently. "Miss